celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life with Stirling Faux on AM 650.
Welcome back to Boomer Life. Our guest in studio from Sands & Associates is Senior Vice President Blair Mantin. You know that feeling when the phone rings and you're scared to answer it? Or maybe there's a stack of unopened mail that you're afraid to look at? Maybe there's some threat of legal action, or maybe you're just shuffling money from credit card to stay ahead of a mountain of interest. Blair, you deal with people who find themselves in this unfortunate situation every day, you and your colleagues at Sands & Associates. And I should mention, friends, they have 10 offices around Metro Vancouver. So what should you do when you can't pay your debts, Mr. Mantin? Where does one begin?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is really take stock of the situation. So, how much money do you owe? How bad is this problem? If it's a matter of it's a few $1,000s in debt, you've had a couple lean months, but you're going to be able to pay that off over the next few months. You might not need much more than to sit down and really just readjust your budget, and you're going to be able to get yourself out of that situation pretty quickly.
Okay.
If it's more than that, if it's something more severe, if you start to add up and open all that mail, and suddenly you're looking at $10,000 or $20,000 or even more of consumer debt, and realistically that you can only devote a certain amount of your budget per month to debt repayment, and it's going to take you forever to get out of this hole,
right?
Well, then you need to arm yourself with the information. You need to understand what exists out there, what legislation the government has put in place to help consumers get back on their feet. The wording from the law is it's for the honest but unfortunate debtor. Mm-hmm. If you've been honest but you've been unfortunate, and generally the people that I see, it's something has happened. It's job loss, medical issues, relationship breakdown, or an income tax assessment. If something's happened and there's been a shock to the system and you're no longer able to pay your bills, you need to have a conversation with somebody who's going to be independent, who's going to advise you and explain everything to you, who's going to take the time to understand your situation and give you options.
But
that's what you need.
As we mentioned at the beginning of the program, let's face it, this is a public process. You are licensed by the Government of Canada. Mm-hmm. If I sit down, there's going to be a file. There's going to be some registry with some court somewhere. This is a matter of public record now. The whole world's going to know that I'm a financial flop, that I'm an imperfect person. Oh gosh, there's a shocker, eh? But most of us are proud people. Mm-hmm. We like to think that we're capable, certainly, of managing our own personal finances, and yet we can't, clearly. What's a typical amount for a person to end up across the desk from you, carrying and unable to cope with?
The average is in around $40,000. Okay. I think that's the point where people really start to say, wow, this is just really taking on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. I see, it really depends on the profile of the person. If it's someone on pension income who they know they're not going to be making any more money next year, or just marginally more than they're making this year, and they've got $12,000 or $15,000 in debt, that might be enough for them to say, well, I'm not going to be able to pay this off, in my reasonable life expectancy.
Sure,
even.
Sure, yeah.
So that's the fastest demographic that I see, actually, is the elderly, the folks who thought they would have everything sorted out by the time they were ready for their golden years, and they've carried debt into retirement, and now so much of their pension income is going just to stay ahead of minimum payment charges. Now you mentioned, Sterling, as well, that when you go in to see a trustee, it's a public admission of failure, and that's something I really want to hit dead on.
Okay, because that's the perception. I don't know whether it's correct or not, Blair, but that's the perception. The stigma attached to going bankrupt. It really is. You've literally dropped off a cliff. You're in that great black hole of financial flops, and it's a toughie for people to wrap their heads around.
I think the concept, when it's described that way, is really tough for people to wrap their heads around, yes. I think when people get to the facts, which we're going to talk about, in general, no one's going to know. Okay? There's very, very few circumstances where there has to be a notice in the newspaper. I have tons of clients. There's been one this year. I had to do a notice in the newspaper. It ran for one day. I don't think any of his friends or family even saw it.
Right.
Everybody else, it's what's called a summary administration, which means there's no newspaper notice. There's no meeting of all your creditors where they're going to, yell at you and call you a bad person. That's not going to happen.
Okay.
It's going to be between you, the people you owe money to, because the trustee has to notify them that they're not going to get paid, unfortunately, and it's within the court system. So if someone really wants wanted to figure out have you went bankrupt, there's a database they could search. They'd have to register, pay $8 every time they search even one syntax. No one uses that database. So it's generally a pretty private process. There are people in my life who have had to go through this, and I wouldn't have known unless they had told me, and I'm a trustee. There's probably people in your lives. Generally, everybody knows somebody who's had to take one of these steps. It's
Absolutely.
It's more than 100,000 people in Canada every year go through a process like this, and trust me, there are people who you would have never have expected that had to go through this who are incredibly successful now. And I think where, one message I want people to understand is I think we hold ourselves to this impossibly high moral standard that we don't necessarily apply to corporations.
Well,
for
that's
example,
true. That's true. Well, for example, even the cowboys in Alberta, you see these oil guys, they'll go out and they'll borrow $200 million and invest it in some hole in the ground somewhere. And of course, there's nothing but dust in there. And they go, oh, well, we'll just go bankrupt. What the heck? We'll write that one off and move on. It's just a method of doing business. It's another way of having another day at the shop. And from a corporate level, it's seen as a kind of a cavalier strategy that doesn't matter one way or the other. But on a personal level, it's a whole different ballgame, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, and I would say, do you think Air Canada is a bad company because they had to go through bankruptcy? Now they're incredibly successful.
Sure.
A lot of celebrities have had to go through bankruptcy. Some mismanagement generally there because the income wasn't the problem, but they've emerged successfully on the other side. So, at the end of the day, if you compare the degree of morality you hold individuals to compared to businesses, at the end of the day, debt is debt. I think there is a bit of a mismatch, and people are incredibly hard on themselves. They put themselves through all kinds of hardship, of austerity, of living on $100 or $200 a month in groceries because they're paying everybody.
This is boomer life. We're talking about baby boomers. I'm a baby boomer. I was raised with very strong, very high standards by my parents who were war babies. My parents grew up in Ontario in the 20s and 30s. They had nothing. They had absolutely nothing. And so every penny they've made their whole lives has mattered a great deal. And somehow or another, they tried to pass that message along to us, their boomer kids. Well, we're not as smart as they thought we were or hoped we would be. And a lot of us are in trouble, even in our 50s and 60s and beyond. And here's a sad fact that I want you to help me to get our listeners to understand. Because we assume so much. I'm not going to go broke. I'm not going to go to some trustee. I'm not going to be a public failure. I'm going to cash in my RSP if it matters. I'm going to pay every damn dime I owe. So all my savings, all of my retirement, I'm now going to collapse that, pay the tax, take the cash, and pay off these creditors. Except, wait a second, there are more creditors owed than I have money in my RSP. Well, okay, I'm still going to wipe my RSP out and keep the wolves away from my door for another year or two. So, okay, in Canada, that doesn't have to happen anymore, right?
Exactly.
You can go bankrupt, and they can't touch your RSP. I didn't know that. Give us some background.
Very few people do know that. So the law changed in 2009, and I wish this was something that was more widely known because I have people walk into my office having done exactly that.
Yeah.
They owed, say it was $80,000, they had $50,000 in their RSPs. They took that out, paid off as much as they could, and then still they had to go bankrupt
behind the eight ball.
or
Exactly.
do a proposal. Or in some cases, they've cashed the RSPs, they've cleared the debt, but they haven't addressed the underlying problem. So a couple of years later, they're still as much in debt as they were before because they didn't have, really that day of reckoning where they had to say, okay, here's my budget going forward. Here's the counseling I'm going to get from the trustee who's going to help me be on the right path going forward.
Right.
So the facts are in Canada, pensions have always been exempt. If you go bankrupt, no one can touch your pension, and that's the way it should be. You can't be, made a pauper for the rest of your life.
Right.
Okay? Previous to 2009, RRSPs were not exempt. So if you went bankrupt and you were someone who had saved privately for your retirement your entire life, you had to surrender those RRSPs. It was so unjust it had to change, and it did. So now, if someone comes to my office and they have RRSPs, the only thing that's at risk is anything they've put in the last 12 months. And that makes sense because if you're building up a bunch of debt because you're throwing it into your RSPs, well, that's not right.
Yeah, you should not have been putting it in the RSP. You should have been addressing some of those indebted concerns.
Right. So there's a lot of common sense there.
But your RRSP is no longer a commodity that can be snatched from you by your creditors.
Exactly. So if one person is hearing this and they were thinking of cashing in their RSPs and they're going to come and see a trustee and understand that they're protected, that's success to me today, because you don't want to make people feel bad. But when people come in and confess to me that they've done this, I tell them, but I say, okay, you can't dwell on it, but I wish you had known sooner, because now you've really compromised your ability to have that comfortable retirement that you had saved your whole life for.
And I'm afraid, and I regret this, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying this. I think more than a few people listening to this conversation right now are going to find themselves in that situation. Unwilling to seek professional assistance, unwilling to publicly admit to any ineptitude financially. Mm-hmm. They have addressed their issues as best they could, and they have collapsed every dime they ever made to give to some credit card company. So now they have no savings, and they're still in the hole. Mm-hmm. So, but since 2009, it's a different ball game in BC. So if you are at the point in your life right now, listening to this program where the wolf is at the door, you're getting these ugly letters, people are screaming at you on your own private telephone in your own home, and every time you turn around, somebody's going to want money because you owe everybody. Mm-hmm. You are done for in your mind, and you're going to forfeit everything you've ever saved. Your whole life is over. Well, guess what, friends? It's not over. It can be made much, much better, much more, shall I say, livable, Blair? Mm-hmm. Life can be livable again with the assistance of a competent professional, a trustee in bankruptcy.
Well, exactly, Stirling. So RSPs are one thing where people thought they would lose it, but people have the perception they're going to lose everything if they have to go through bankruptcy.
Absolutely.
Almost everybody that I deal with, they finish bankruptcy with the same assets they had when they started it. Most people don't have a house that has a ton of equity in it, and there's an exemption. You're allowed a minimal amount of equity if you have a house. So some people going through bankruptcy actually helps them keep their house.
Right.
You're allowed to keep a vehicle if it's worth less than $5,000. No one can seize that from you. Most people don't know that, and collection agents aren't going to tell you that. You're allowed to keep your tools of the trade worth up to $10,000. So it would make no sense if you were going to seize a person's ability to earn income. So there are a bunch of exemptions that really do allow people to emerge from bankruptcy able to get on with their life, not having given everything, all their worldly possessions, to the trustee.
There's just a ton of incredibly useful information you're providing us, Blair Mantin. We do appreciate this. When we come back, I want to talk about the 2 remedies that any trustee in bankruptcy would offer. You have your 10 offices and lots of colleagues at Sands & Associates quite familiar with consumer proposals or personal bankruptcies. We'll find out what those options are, what they mean, and which one might apply to your circumstances, which would be the better option for you. Our guest is Blair Mantin, Senior Vice President with Sands & Associates here in the Metro Vancouver area. WeHelpWithDebt.com is their terrific website. Back after this.
It's all about the baby boomer lifestyle. Boomer Life on AM 650.